get started. Can everybody hear me? Can someone hear me? Say so in the chat.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. All right. So hello. I'd like to welcome everyone to breakout session 4, using the ACS to measure spatial inequality. For those of you that attended yesterday, Denise Ross with the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy urged us to be champions of equitable data. And we are lucky to have several of those champions presenting today. We are going to have a question and answer session at the end of the presentations. So if you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A box at any time. But please use the Q&A box and not the chat. And then at the end of the session, I will read them out. So let's get started. I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Francisco Castellanos Sosa from the University of Texas, Austin.
Hey, hello, Mara. Thank you for the introduction. At this moment, I am in the transition of moving from UT Austin to the Texas Census Institute. So what you're going to see is the updated set of slides. Now, the main title, of course, is Spatial Income Inequality in the US. And here, I would like to mention that the outline of this presentation is the traditional academic paper outline, such that we start with the motivation and follow up to the policy implications. Well, as you all know, income inequality in the US is increasing. And when we start talking about income inequality, it is common to think about the states, but it is also common to think about counties. And well, regardless that it's not so well used or not too often used, there is another way to measure this, and it's at the commuting zone level. The commuting zones, as you all know, is this set of counties in which people used to live and work and that are interconnected, and therefore this makes them a local labor market. So when we disaggregate and estimate inequality in the US into 722 commuting zones, we can see that there is an increase in income inequality in almost all of these commuting zones. And from 2005 to 2019, there is a drastic change in the distribution of inequality in the US. So, to what degree is this increase in the overall inequality because of the dynamics happening within the local labor markets or between local labor markets? And also, what are these local labor markets who are exerting the highest pressure in the overall income inequality patterns? This is what we're going to be talking today. In terms of the policy relevance, of course, we all know that income inequality is important for several issues, but primarily it has been noted by the giants in these topics that inequality is related to the fight against poverty. Also, it is one of the causes of persistent poverty. And well, there are some patterns as the fastest growth of the wages at the top, which is primarily driving inequality in so many ways. In addition, income inequality is in the middle and center of so many other problems and public policy issues. So when there is low income inequality, it means a more egalitarian or equal society. It is supposed to happen a movement towards economic development. However, the theory also signals that economic development comes with some other elements like globalization, automation, trade, capital flows, such that they used to create higher income inequality. And then we have this kind of cycle in which an unequal distribution of political and economic powers create democratic interests, and then we move on towards these specific issues at the interior of the country, like political competition, regulations in the labor markets, and the redistribution debate on the taxes and transfers. So we have all of this cycle, and income inequality is there. It's part of the evolution of the countries. So in particular, the main contributions to the literature, as I separated, is according to the local labor market dynamics. And the local labor market dynamics is separated into two waves. The first wave, which is the starting wave, in which the people at the census and other scholars started to figuring out that commuting zones exist, that people is interconnected regardless that they live in different counties. So Tolbert and Caesar in 1996 coined these commuting zones element as the local labor market. And then there is a current wave, something more new, which is embracing Tolbert and Caesar and applying it into several other topics. Then my next set of contributions, or the ones that I at least try to present here, is to the literature on income inequality studies, but not overall income inequality as the traditional differences on wages between groups, but into particular scholarly work that is focused in exploring inequality itself and the measurements of inequality. Therefore, the closest pieces to this paper are the ones of Galbraith and Hale and Liao 2019 decomposition. Liao 2019 decomposition is doing something innovative, and it's separating the tail index into two other segments, and we're going to talk about it in a couple of minutes. In terms of the empirical contributions, this paper is providing this set of new estimates of income inequality at this commuting zone level from 2005-2019 in the US, and it explores a new disaggregation, the one of Liao, and this disaggregation happens at the shared and differentiated structures of the household's income distribution. Here is the part in which I'm going to go a little bit deep and then continue with the presentation. When we plot the distribution of income of each commuting zone, of course, one of them are going to have a longer right tail, some of them are going to have a shorter right tail, and we'll note that the left part of the income distribution at the commuting zone level is going to be starting close to zero because people start having income at zero. So this is the interesting part. If they all start at zero, there is going to be a differentiated part at the right. So the area or the range encompassed by the minimum maximum of the income levels of the commuting zones creates this range of shared part or shared structure of income distribution for the commuting zones. And therefore, the part out of that, this means the part of the right tails, which is the part in which the richest people is technically concentrated, it is going to conform the differentiated structure. So Liao's decomposition primarily is suggesting if you put all of the distribution shapes all together, there is going to be a part in the right and the left that is going to be differentiated, and there is going to be a part in the center which is going to be shared. However, because of the way in which the income distribution is scattered in the commuting zones, all of them start at zero, and the differentiated part only appears at the right tail. So by exploring this, we can observe how the income inequality coming from the right tails, this is from the richest households in the commuting zones, can be affecting the patterns of the overall inequality. Then another empirical contribution is the analysis and the estimates of the spatial correlation of the local labor markets, such that beyond of only analyzing commuting zones as the group of counties, I am exploring how related commuting zones are among them, such that we can identify maybe that income inequality is agglomerating in groups of commuting zones, not only in groups of counties. So the data and methodology, of course, as we all are working with the ACS, is the American Community Survey. You know the 2005 origin, it's because of the consistency of the data, and it goes to 2019. Why? Because I'm trying to avoid the COVID-19 period, and this is going to create a picture pre-COVID such that we can have a continuation of this study after COVID, after some years, and figure out how inequality changed in its geography. So the level for the panel, of course, is 722 commuting zones. And the lowest data level, in this case, the lowest unit in which I am routing this analysis is households. Definitely, this is something that we all like and enjoy playing with. It is the summary statistics of the ACS. As you know, it is approximately 110 million households in 2005. It goes to 122 million of 2019. This is the mean income, the standard deviations, and the maximums. Of course, the minimums are close to zero, and technically they are all in $1 in all years. And the values, of course, are deflated to 1999 prices. In terms of the methodology, as you have realized, it is mostly about estimation. So the tails index is estimated as usual and traditionally. It is an entropy inequality index. So the tail index, the overall tail index is the equation in the top. It is disaggregated into two parts, the within part and the between part. The difference in the within part is that the within part is focused in analyzing how dispersed the income is across households inside each commuting zone. And the between part is trying to figure out how income is distributed across and among the commuting zones itself. So Liao's decomposition in 2016, what it's doing is separating the within part, which is the first part, into two parts. So this is one of the rich parts of the tails index, and it's mathematically decomposition without losing other properties. So the Moran's I index is technically this correlation across neighboring commuting zones, such that we have a spatial matrix of contiguity, such that this correlation is estimated for each commuting zone and the average of the commuting zones surrounding that commuting zone. And then I follow up with some OLS elasticities to identify how the dynamics of the within and between elements affect the overall dynamics, and the dynamics of the within shared and within differentiated part and the between part altogether affect the overall inequality. So the results. Well, when I estimate the Moran's I index for the spatial correlation, I do this at different circles or ratios of distance for each commuting zone. And as you can expect, when you are close, you have this blue line in terms of level of spatial correlation, which is statistically significant, different from zero. And the Moran's I index goes from -1 to 1. So having this close to 0.40 spatial correlation means something, and it might imply that indeed inequality might be related to natural resources or to state policies or to other economic environments going on across different commuting zones. And definitely, if we expand the ratio, the spatial correlation starts diminishing. Then in the evolution of the tail index, the blue line is the overall inequality. The dashed red line is the within part. This is common, this is normal, and it is because the within part is encompassing mostly the differences that happen at each commuting zone, which are technically representative of the national level, so they follow the same dynamic. The problem with that is that if we use that one, we already know that there is almost a perfect correlation, so we need this decomposition. When we decompose, the thing breaks down. And this is the decomposition of Liao in the within shared and the within differentiated. The within shared is the part below, and differentiated is the part above. So the inequality in the right tails is much higher than the one happening in the center. When I estimate the elasticities, you can figure out this is the within part and the overall, the between part and the overall in the panel B, and the within shared in the C, and the within differentiated in the D. If they are solids, of course, they have a statistically significant effect. In this case, we do not have any effect when analyzing them separately. But if we move on, fast forward to the entire model in which we introduce the shared part, the differentiated part, and the between component, we can observe how the within differentiated part, the one of the right tails, indeed is driving the overall dynamics, these annual changes on the income inequality. So the next part, and this is something simple, if the between part, not the within, the between part, can be disaggregated by commuting zones, we can identify those commuting zones that up to some point have a much higher income share than households share. In this case, the big ones we already know are New York, New Jersey, DC, Boston, Seattle, and some areas in California like the LA, Riverside, San Francisco, and San Jose. And if we figure out this in terms of the positive and the negative, in the case of the negative ones, we have those in which there is a higher proportion of households, which is higher than the proportion of income they embrace. And something interesting happened in the negative side. In the negative side, we can see some sort of clusters of cities related to tourism, like Las Vegas, like Tampa, like Miami, but also we can check it out some border areas like McAllen, El Paso, or some formerly industrial places like San Antonio, Buffalo, Cleveland, so Greensboro. So what these parties suggesting is that there are some areas in which the income is being less concentrated and is allowing people to concentrate more. So something is happening here in the negative side, while in the other ones, of course, we can see the big cities, but the thing that mostly all of them have in common is the financial districts and the high-tech companies. Policy implications, of course, some redistributive policies should be reconsidered in terms of the local labor market dynamics. And also we have this sort of debate between the high-tech and financial and the tourism, border, and formerly industrial thing. Of course, in terms of recommendations, well, it might be about on the wealth taxes and redistribution through social transfers and social insurance policies, according to what the experts suggest for these sort of scenarios like these ones. So this is primarily it. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you, Francisco. If anyone has any questions for Francisco, put them in the Q&A box and we will read them later. Our next speaker is Ellen Esch from the Twin Cities Metropolitan Council.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to this session. So my name is Ellen, and I'm with the Metropolitan Council, and I'll be presenting on a project that we call Growing Shade, which is a tree planting, canopy enhancement, and preservation tool. So this is the general outline of what I'll be talking about over the next 15 minutes. So first, I'll explain where this project came from and how it connects to regional policy and planning initiatives. Following this, I'll discuss tree planting and canopy preservation as a sustainable solution to intersecting regional issues. I'll finish with an explanation of the interactive tool, and questions, as Mara said, will be taken at the end of this full session. So first, I'd just like to talk about how trees fit into planning initiatives. And for those of you who haven't heard of us before, the Metropolitan Council is the metropolitan planning organization for the Twin Cities region in Minnesota, which you can see highlighted in blue in the small map at the bottom of this slide. We're home to about 3 million people, which is about half the state of Minnesota's population. And during the last cycle of long-range planning that was led by the Met Council, 5 key outcomes were identified in this regional policy guide, which we called Thrive MSP 2040. And those outcomes are in the top of this screen. And it can be argued that trees intersect with all 5 of these outcomes, but I'll focus here on 2 outcomes that really form the foundation of this project, which is sustainability and equity. So Thrive MSP defines sustainability as protecting our region's vitality for generations to come, and trees play a big role in sustainability because a single tree is an expression of policy that can span several human generations. In addition, we need to recognize that land use, environmental, and climate change policies affect groups differently. And so this project centers environmental justice considerations in the stories and in the interactive tool. Before going too much further, I do just want to pause and zoom out a bit. I think it's important to state that these core principles of including trees in planning initiatives, it does apply nationwide, and many cities and regions share sustainability and equity goals and have climate action plans, and trees are a natural tie-in with that work. And in developing Growing Shade, our stakeholder engagement process did inform a really highly targeted and nuanced approach to create a decision-making tool centered around trees, which was actionable for our specific Twin Cities region. But in the process, we did learn of other resources which could be helpful for folks living outside the Twin Cities region. And this map at left, for instance, just shows areas for which a tree equity score exists, which you may have heard of. But if there's anyone in this audience with whom a really bespoke process resonates with, my email address is at the end of this presentation, and you can feel free to reach out if you think that learning more about our methodology and the open source tools we use to analyze the data and build the Growing Shade platform would be valuable for your local efforts. So throughout the course of developing Growing Shade, I took a close look at 4 key issues that intersect with the tree canopy. And these issues are environmental justice, climate change, conservation of natural resources, and public health. So briefly, we know that trees are not distributed evenly around the region, and certain groups disproportionately face negative consequences of land use decisions. This fact underlies the overlap between trees and environmental justice. Climate change is another big issue facing our region. With rising temperatures and altered precipitation patterns, trees and other green infrastructure can be useful in mitigating some of these impacts. Trees also provide valuable benefits of sequestering carbon and providing habitat for biodiversity. So preserving the existing tree canopy and considering the value of natural resources in making land use decisions can help our region grow and change sustainably into the future. And then finally, we know that trees are linked to better health for people. Trees improve both air and water quality and are linked to improve physical and mental health of residents. So growing the tree canopy can help improve public health. And this map is just showing an overview of the relevance of these 4 key issues across our region, with the colors indicating the highest priority in each census block group. This map is an overview, and we know that local level issues may be different or need a more tailored focus. So engagement has been really important throughout this process. Now, given that broad overview, now I'll share some of the history behind this overlap and provide recent data that shows how these issues play out on the ground. The first thing to know is that across our region and across the nation, racist policies and history have impacted today's environmental conditions. So in the Twin Cities region, systematic seizure of indigenous lands and genocide occurred as Dakota and Ojibwe people were coerced into signing land cession treaties beginning in 1805. And while the 200 years which have passed since the early 1800s span multiple human generations, this history is easily recorded within the lifetime of a single tree. And this fact really makes poignant the profound impact that racist policies and history have had in influencing today's environmental conditions. Black communities have also been disproportionately exploited and impacted by land use decisions and policy. So redlining, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, was a government-sanctioned practice that was practiced around the nation starting in 1934, and the maps on the left of this screen show which areas were redlined in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this policy intentionally excluded Black families from home ownership and denied all access to capital in predominantly Black neighborhoods. While the specific practice of redlining didn't occur for all areas across the nation, racist lending and loan practices were widespread. And redlining has lasting consequences today, including lower tree canopy in these areas. Creating infrastructure also left lasting negative consequences on minority communities, with Black residents and businesses being displaced as 2 major interstate corridors in our region were constructed. And today this leaves Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color disproportionately impacted by lack of trees and green space and having higher exposure to land cover of impervious surfaces. Pollutants from vehicle exhaust also bring respiratory health issues to communities situated along interstates. So in summary, all of these racist policies have lasting consequences, and it's why environmental justice is a key issue identified in this project. Of course, these issues are not unique to our region, nor is this a comprehensive list of environmental justice issues. And it is encouraging to see researchers and media outlets start to uncover these stories nationally. And it's been a real pleasure to add Growing Shade to that mix, and just really being able to highlight that this project focuses more precisely on our region's unique history in a way that generalized tools or trends cannot. So with that background, here are the data for our region, which show disparities in tree canopy cover with income and race. In each of these plots, the roughly 2,000 census block groups across our 7-county region are plotted. So the panel on the left shows that tree canopy increases sharply with household income up until the median annual income of an area is about $100,000. The panel on the right shows that tree canopy decreases as the share of residents identifying as a person of color gets higher. So do note that these figures are showing tree canopy in 2021. So this is not history. This is on the ground conditions today. And in a more generalized way, these patterns have been shown to apply nationwide. For a bit of context for these numbers and some pictures, I pulled out 2 examples here of 2 different neighborhoods. So an area from St. Paul is shown on the top, and this area has 42% tree canopy cover, median household income of about $120,000, and 9% of residents identify as a person of color. The other example on bottom is from Minneapolis's Camden neighborhood, and this area has less than half the tree canopy and less than half the median income from Summit Hill example, and 6 times more residents identify as a person of color. Interestingly, these 2 neighborhoods share the same population density of about 13 people per acre, so this really isn't a density or a space issue. Now, the inequities in tree canopy cover mean consequences for temperatures, among other things. So as part of an earlier climate vulnerability assessment that happened for our region, an extreme heat map was created, and this map is shown on the left. It identifies differences of up to 40 degrees in land surface temperatures across the region. And these temperature differences do have several key drivers, but we know that taking steps to reduce temperatures is important because extreme heat is deadly. So growing the tree canopy and reducing tree inequity could help reduce heat-related deaths, vulnerability to extreme heat, in addition to considering variables related to the impact that trees can have on respiratory, physical, and mental health. That's covered in our public health lens. And then finally, climate change does underscore the urgency of acting on extreme heat. And the climate change lens in this tool identifies areas most at risk of climate change hazards, including heat and also localized flooding, which trees can help mitigate via improved water filtration. Here's some data just showing what the relationship between summer land surface temperature during a heat wave and the amount of green space looks like for our region. Areas with high amounts of green space, including trees, remain substantially cooler during heat waves. And here are those 2 examples again. So the area with less tree canopy cover has an average temperature of about 97 degrees, whereas the area with more tree canopy cover has a temperature of about 94 degrees during that heat wave. And, this is a couple degrees during a heat wave, but just imagine this stretched out throughout the course of an entire summer. And you can see how that can feed back into these feedback loops where now we're needing to consider the cost of electricity if people have access to cooling in their homes, thinking about the proportion of utility bills as a fraction of annual income. And you can see how this is just a feedback loop where low-income residents are continuously left with disproportionately high burdens across the board. Now, earlier I mentioned the impact of redlining on green space and temperature, and across St. Paul and Minneapolis, areas with the A grade, grades here on the y-axis, those areas still remain cooler during heat waves today, compared to areas formerly graded C or D. D corresponding to redline areas are hotter today. And again, this pattern between historic redlining and current temperatures has been documented nationwide. Now, the final issue I'll describe in more detail is the conservation of natural resources. And by now, hopefully you're all convinced that planting new trees can be helpful, but growing shade really does mean more than planting new trees. It also means preserving existing mature trees so they can continue to grow and provide benefits. Unsurprisingly, mature trees do offer more benefits than younger trees because it takes time for trees to grow and have those canopies which provide shade and habitat and impact water and air quality in a positive way. Of course, there's challenges associated with conserving and growing trees, and that's really why we have this conservation lens to provide a way to consider the importance of these other factors as well. I'm just going to show you a little tool demonstration now, just some screenshots from the live tool. And so I use ACS and other data to identify areas where tree planting or preservation efforts may have the largest benefits and created some options for users to customize the variables that they're interested in. And this has resulted in really custom and bespoke maps and reports for a whole wide range of users. which we've seen result in a number of successful community grants and establishment of cost-sharing tree planting programs, which has been really exciting to be involved with that and kind of hearing some of the impact that this census and also analytic work has had. And there's two URLs on the bottom of this page. Growingshade.com is probably the easiest to remember, and that'll take you to the tool where you can play around, and there's more information there. Importantly, the tool also contains some non-quantitative data. So we interviewed people to create some qualitative data and share stories which really educate about the considerations related to growing shade. And we highlight 5 unique stories, which are listed here and are just really valuable and rich and add a kind of some human context and dimension to this project, and really helps this work resonate with our audiences. So just to recap, Growing Shade is a project which we created in order to make an actionable pathway for trees to be considered in planning work. And we felt this was important because trees do intersect with big regional thorny issues. And the result, which has leveraged ACS data in addition to some other resources, it is a tool that helps people living and working in our region start to understand where limited resources can be directed to have disproportionately positive impacts, and also understand what on-the-ground conditions look like today in order to set goals for the future. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And after the other speakers, I'd certainly be happy to field any questions that you have. My contact information is here, and I, of course, would be happy to hear from you or your colleagues at any time. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Ellen. And again, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. Next up is Roberto Hamchande from the Colegio de la Frontera Norte.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I have my screen there. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this American Community Survey Conference. You will excuse my broken English and my sometimes embarrassing accent. Well, this show and tell from me is about how in Mexico we are using the American Community Survey along with other data sources from the United States and Mexico in the study of the demographics and related issues in the United States and Mexico border. Next screen, please. Okay. That picture is describing that besides a geopolitical line dividing our two countries, the border is also a region. And for statistical, public administration, and planning purposes, we can define the American, as a border region, the American counties that are bordering Mexico, and the Mexican municipios that are contiguous to the United States. Next one, please. Okay. Well, I'm saying there that the border is 3,200 kilometers long, but we have to add that its population is some sort of a scattered along the border, and population is mostly concentrated in just 8 binational pairs of cities. There are binational urban systems. These human settlements are divided by a border, and its adjacency has created a unique demographic and socioeconomic context. When we compare the north side of the border with the south part of the border, those two sides show very deep social and economic differences. Now, the significant feature is that such disparities are the main factor to trigger huge and fundamental international relations of all sorts, like those that are suggesting there and on the screen. Demographic, economic, social, cultural, seeking healthcare. Okay. Next one, please. Now, I have a table there that is saying that a clear impact of the border interrelatedness comes from the demographic dynamics. It's impacting the demographic, and the demographic is impacting also the interrelation. So the table compares the population change from 1930 to 2020 of the United States in blue. That's the part of the table in blue, and of Mexico is the green part. The numbers, the figures are for each nation as a whole and for their border regions. Now, a notorious fact is that both borders, have increased at a higher rate than their respective countries. By 1930, the United States had 0.7% of its population at the border, less than 1%. And by 2020, that portion has increased to 2.4%. In that increasing, we have to admit that the main attraction for the population at the border in the United States is the city of San Diego. For Mexico, figures are 1.7% in 1930 and a notorious 6.2% in 2020. If in another glance at these figures, shows that the border in Mexico has the highest degree of growth of the whole set. Here, the magnetism is the city of Tijuana, just across from San Diego. Next one, please. Okay. Of course, such border population increases cannot come from high fertility. In fact, fertility is declining, and the population growth has to come from migration. Migration to and from the border has its own causes and characteristics and consequences. In this case, they are highly related to binational conditions. This slide is venturing a model about how migration shapes the border region. On the Mexican side, population is almost Mexican. That is, in the Mexican border, there are very few non-Mexicans. There has been a strong migration from the rest of Mexico to the northern border, okay? And minor movements from the border, the Mexican border to the south of Mexico, okay? In the American side, if we can keep showing arrows, please, Mark. Another one, please. The last one, okay. Another one. Okay. I'm sorry about that. I am not handling that myself. So there has been a strong migration from the rest of Mexico to the northern border. I have said that already. The American side has two types of population, those of Mexican origin and those of another ancestry. So we have the non-Mexican origin population and the Mexican origin population on the American side. So very, very few non-Mexican origin population migrate to the border from the rest of the United States. And those living the border to other parts of the United States might have been significant. One exception in this, in the size and the thickness of these arrows is the city of San Diego again. Okay. Well, next, Mark, next screen. Another one. Okay. That's for me. This is a very interesting table. Is all in the United States border, okay? And I'm depicting that the population by ethnicity, and for each of the 8 main urban areas in the United States, and from 1980 to 2020. There are 3 ethnic conditions considered in this table. The non-Hispanics in the blue columns. The Hispanics are in the middle, white color, and the Mexican origin population in green. One remark is the Hispanics include the Mexican origin population. But you can see that the Mexican origin population compose most part of the Hispanics. Overall, these figures, there is a major highlight. The United States south border is under what we might call a Mexicanization process. It can be seen that in time, the non-Hispanic component is decreasing, while Hispanics are increasing, and that this Hispanic population is mainly composed by Mexicans. Even in San Diego, by 1980, there were 85.2% of non-Hispanics, and in 2020, that figure has low to 65.7%. In 2020, San Diego holds 34% of Hispanics, and mainly 30%. And for the year 2020, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I'm saying this wrong. Okay, I'm saying this wrong. In San Diego, in 1980, they have 12% of Mexican origin population, and that has been increasing up to 30% in the year 2020. Okay. You can see that for instance, in the southeastern Texas border counties like Webb, Hidalgo, and Cameron, the Mexican origin population has been close to 90%, and is now almost 90% of the population at the border. Okay, an exception in this Mexicanization trend is the Pima County, and I think that the explanation of that is that the city of Tucson is keeping very, very non-Hispanic. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. Another highlight is the age structure by ethnicity. Okay. According to the American Community Survey, the population pyramid of non-Hispanic populations in the year 2021 is shown in the left side of the graphic. And you can see that that does not resemble a pyramid anymore. It describes that the non-Hispanic population at the border has a very low fertility with a high portion of elderlies and a conspicuous dent in the Middle Ages. Okay? An assumption about such depression in the Middle Ages is that there might have been a significant migration away from the border of young and adult non-Hispanics. On the other side of the graph, the right side, there is the age structure. It is the age structure of the Mexican origin population. It is still keeping a pyramidal shape, although is now clearly showing a decline in fertility. For a while to come, aging at the Mexican origin population will not be a concern, and it will be much more youngsters than the non-Mexican population. Okay, and that's something very significant that is causing other types of relations at the border, specifically the north part of the border, the U.S. part. Okay. Now I have a last screen, please. Well, finally, and resulting from what I have been discussing, this last screen is suggesting several questions and proposals to review and advance in the demographic and socioeconomic environment of the United States-Mexico border. The main goal will be projections and scenarios considering political issues, sustainability, and change to come about climate change and the availability of water. We are already planning to do that using the American Community Survey. And a main question is what's going to happen with that conspicuous Mexicanization of the American border. Migration, of course, and you have seen the recent news about that, is very important for the region. Also, we have to take into account that the such long border has a great diversity. It is very different the urban system of San Diego, Tijuana, compared to other from El Paso, Juarez, or from McAllen, Laredo, or all those. So we have to look at that. It is a diverse conditions along the border. Okay. And of course, now we have big questions all over the world about habitability of countries and regions, and how suitable are they for settlements and the economy, for employment or education or health services. All this is our challenge to come. And of course, now the big concerns are about climate change and the availability of energy and access to water. And I will finish with this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto. Any questions for Roberto? Please put them in the Q&A. So last, but definitely not least, we have Matt Schroeder from the Twin Cities Metropolitan Council.
Yes, hi everyone. I am Matt Schroeder from the Metropolitan Council. I trust that someone will tell me if you cannot see a PowerPoint slide right now.
That's good.
Thank you. It doesn't look like my camera is on either. I'm not sure if that's a problem. I know that people with vision difficulties can prefer seeing someone talk, but as far as I know, it's set to being on. So sorry if you can't see me. So anyway, my goal today is to incorporate I think a bit of lessons from all these presentations, and to talk about getting beyond this framework of concentrated poverty when we're talking about advancing place-based equity. So the reason that we care about this, of course, is that, as probably no surprise, people in high poverty neighborhoods experience worse outcomes in a variety of dimensions, especially children. So this whole concept of place-based equity that we're going for is that where you live shouldn't affect your life chances. So this is really tied up with this whole conversation around the opportunity that's been very much in the news over the past several years. But when we're doing this, when we're talking about advancing place-based equity, it's really important to think about how we do that when we're developing policies to make sure that people's environments don't affect their life chances. Really important to think about this quote from the Metropolitan Council's Equity Advisory Committee co-chair, who said, "The stories that we tell ourselves matter. Narrative plays an important role in defining whose voice gets heard, how issues are framed, and what solutions are developed." So please just keep this in mind during the presentation, because it's kind of a theme that I'll come back to. So how this all started, about 10 years ago, the Metropolitan Council got a Sustainable Communities Planning grant from HUD. And as part of that, we needed to identify what eventually became areas of concentrated poverty. If anyone's familiar with the assessments of fair housing that HUD tried to start up maybe 7 years ago, this was kind of the precursor to that. So these were basically just areas with high poverty rates. So I'll just point out Minneapolis here, as well as St. Paul. So kind of at the core of the region with lots of high poverty areas are Minneapolis and St. Paul, as well as some of the suburbs as well. But we, over the years, as we tried to use these for things like funding decisions and bus stop improvements, we started to see how simplistic this was, because poverty exists everywhere in the region. I'll flip back and forth to highlight that. And really only a minority of people in poverty in the region actually live in an ACP, area of concentrated poverty. And then too, if we're trying to influence places with high poverty and affect them, why do we cut them off hard at 40%? The conditions probably aren't demonstrably different in tracts with a 39% poverty rate versus a 41% poverty rate, but under our framework, only one of those, the 41%, would be eligible for additional funding, for example. And that's especially problematic given the sampling error inherent in the ACS estimates that makes it hard to identify even which tracts are above 40%. So that's one aspect of how this whole framework, the concentrated poverty framework, kind of oversimplifies the scope of poverty, and as well as characteristics of places. Another one is the wide variation across ACP. So this dot that you see here in the bottom left is the one ACP census tract with a very low share of residents with a college degree. And then adding another tract, another, and then the full distribution shows how wide a range there is of formal educational attainment among ACP tracts. And the same is true for households that lack a vehicle, for the share of housing units that are multifamily, the share of residents who identify as white and non-Latino, and then the share of households that own their home. So very widespread here. Comparing them to the regional averages shown here in green X's, some are, they exist, these regional averages exist within these ranges. So it's not that, for example, areas of concentrated poverty always and everywhere have higher shares of households who lack a vehicle than the region as a whole. Definitely patterns, but nothing to make into concrete definitive statements. So what became clear here is that poverty rates simply can't be a proxy for every kind of need a community might have, since, again, if you're trying to prioritize areas for transit improvements, then looking at the share of households who lack a vehicle might be a better way to do that than to look only at poverty rates. And then we also, as we engaged with users and heard additional critiques, we kind of bumped up against the limits of demographic data. Because if we're really trying to capture the essence of places, we can't just rely on demographic data. We can't, with that, capture lived experience like community and culture that's developed over generations, as well as political engagement and all the ways that the government affects different neighborhoods as well. But there's, I think, a broader point here that's useful to consider. Here's a quote from Ed Getz, who's a professor at the University of Minnesota, who's written thoughtfully about this concept of opportunity in community development, which is that when we're talking about opportunity, we need to think not just about the characteristics of people who live in areas. We need to think about the characteristics of the places themselves. So things like what kind of buildings exist in neighborhoods and who owns them. Getting to Ellen's presentation, what about the environment and natural features? Sorts of institutions, schools, and nonprofits, and what kind of infrastructure exists in these areas, as well as what jobs exist. And who the employers are. So lots of features that are really more tied to place than the characteristics of people. So really restricting our conversations around opportunity to the characteristics of the people who live in places really misses a whole lot. And I guess the critique that we eventually heard that was hardest to reckon with was that our concentrated poverty framework really did some concrete, tangible harm to communities, that focusing only on poverty and not the other end of the income spectrum, that forgetting to highlight the root causes, the discrimination and disinvestment that's occurred over the decades, that looking only at problems, not looking at the assets, not looking at the attachments, the neighborhood organizations that the people have developed over generations, really promotes a deficit-based narrative that the residents of these places are the problem, not so much the systems that create them, as well as creating kind of a need, I guess, a mindset that they need investments, any investments that don't necessarily reflect their needs, and can potentially risk displacing them. And so the overall message that we had to realize that we were sending was that areas of concentrated poverty need to be saved, when what they're really asking for is a seat at the table in influencing the decisions that affect them. So that leads us to how we responded to this by providing what we hope is a more comprehensive portrait of neighborhoods in the Twin Cities called the Equity Considerations Dataset. And I'll get into some of those expanded characteristics in a second, but I did want to say a bit about that name, which seems kind of weird on its face, Equity Considerations, but we did choose it for a reason, we really wanted to emphasize that these are just considerations, things to think about when our stakeholders are trying to decide how to advance place-based equity. More data is always great, but we can't stop there, because without considering the voices of residents who live there and really centering them, we're just going to risk reproducing the same sort of problems that are well-intentioned policies, like the concentrated poverty framework, had created. So one of the things that we heard in our engagement efforts around this was, I kind of alluded to this, but why are you so focused on poverty? Why aren't you considering the whole income spectrum? Isn't concentrated affluence as much of a systemic problem? And so to respond to that, we also have started identifying areas of concentrated affluence, so higher income areas. And we're really hoping that this shifts the focus away from the concentrated poverty itself from low-income neighborhoods to patterns across different places and the fact that inequality exists across these places, and from there to focus on the systems that have created concentrated poverty over the years. And we also heard a demand for one of the ways that concentrated poverty has emerged, which is to look at, again, something that Ellen highlighted, the Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining maps. Available only for Minneapolis and St. Paul, unfortunately. But we've also got data on racially restrictive covenants from the Mapping Prejudice Project at the University of Minnesota. And these restrictive covenants were clauses written into property deeds that prevented them from being sold to people of color. But including explicitly spelled out African American people and Indigenous or Native American people or Asian people. So until 1948, these were in deeds and really restricted where people could live and buy property. And so one of the things that we wanted to do here was not just to stop at that, but to help these different levels of geography be able to be compared to others. So, for example, covenants exist at the parcel level. They're tied to specific properties. So we summarize them to census tracts so that people can better compare the demographics of these areas and other characteristics against the share of homes with covenants. And again, we can see patterns that areas with lots of covenants tend to be have a higher share of residents today who identify as white, non-Latino, shown here in darker shades of purple on the map. And then in this map, darker shades of green indicate higher shares of residents who have higher incomes. And so again, these are just considerations, things to think about. I really, again, don't want to oversimplify things here because this is not a deterministic relationship by any means. We also really don't want to promote too simple a causal chain here. The causal chain connecting covenants and income and race today is complicated, as it is for redlining too. But we also don't want to focus excessively on government and let the private sector off the hook. And I'll say a bit more about that later. But still, I mean, I think very important to think about these as some of the root causes of how places have evolved over time. Another thing that we heard a demand for was more detailed demographics than the standard OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, federal government race categories can get. And to do that, we used ancestry data from the ACS to look, in this case, at the share of residents who show up here as Black or African American, in this case, who are descendants of enslaved people, versus the sub-Saharan African community in the Twin Cities. We do have this broken down into our large Somali populations and Liberian populations and so on. But summarized here, we can kind of go back and forth and see the different distributions of these, which really matters when you're trying to engage residents for how you plan events and the translation services that you plan. So important for local governments and other stakeholders to consider that as well. Again, not perfect by any means, but we are, I guess our orientation was more that even imperfect data for questions that people really want to answer is still worthwhile. We also included a lot of data on housing. So in this case, areas in blue on these maps show areas where rents have really increased a lot over between 2010 and 2020, basically. And then on the map, larger circles there show where there's been a lot lot of construction, basically. And so you can kind of distinguish between areas that have experienced a lot of rent change without a lot of construction, which suggests that existing housing is getting less affordable, versus areas that have had a lot of new construction and where the construction of higher rent apartments may have contributed to this this rise in rents, even though existing housing may not have. Ellen mentioned this before, so summarizing the heat temperatures to census tracts can also be useful for examining the differential exposure of people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color to extreme heat. Again, don't want to take these the specific numbers, the estimated numbers of people that coming out of the ACS as all that meaningful as so much as the patterns that emerge here. But we've also tried to include, again, to focus on assets as well, proximity to libraries. So darker shades of green here show essentially more proximity to libraries. And so what we see is that in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and specifically those higher poverty areas, they actually are closer to libraries. And so there are assets here that also have some relevance to opportunity. So not simply promoting this deficit-based framework. Even though a lot of the stuff that I've mentioned here has talked is kind of unique to the Twin Cities region, we at the Met Council collect a lot of data ourselves and have some great resources that we've acquired from our partners. Lots of this is available outside the region as well. So different sources of pollution, especially the EJ screen data, which can be useful. We also heard a large demand for investment data, so which I guess gets again to the role of institutions in the private sector in different areas. And here, it really shows up pretty strongly how we have not yet brought this out, but we will soon. Poverty rates, darker shades of purple are in the map as higher poverty rates over on the right. And the left shows darker shades of blue or purple with more residential loans going to them, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data on single family loans. And so what we're seeing in these high poverty areas is not so much a shortage of public investment over the past decades as a shortage of private investment. So again, important things to consider there. With that, I'll wrap up and look forward to your questions. Feel free to check out our website at metrocouncil.org/data to find out more information about this and other things. But thank you.
All right. Thank you, Matt. So we have time for questions. I see that our presenters have been very busy answering the questions already. So please put any questions you have in the Q&A and please specify who the question is for. I am going to kick off with a question of my own for Matt. Did you find that there was any pushback from going from a simple poverty index to a more complicated one, or did you find that people were just happy to get more detail?
There was a bit of I wouldn't say pushback so much as apprehension, maybe, that people were used to these. People had kind of knit these into policies, not just at the Met Council, but also in local governments. And so kind of getting away from this simple cut and dried, what seemed like a cut and dried indicator of places to focus on in advancing place-based equity kind of was difficult to accept. But yeah, I think it's helped people, I think, kind of broaden the narrative, especially for local government staff who kind of get these concepts and want to influence their elected officials and their leadership to think more like this as well. So yeah, some apprehension at first, but I think it's ultimately it's been a good thing and people have appreciated it.
Thank you. Again, if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have a question for Roberto. What is the source of the Municipio data? Does Mexico have a national survey comparable to the American Community Survey?
Well, once again, what was the question?
What is the source for the Mexican data? Is there a comparable Mexican census?
I'm sorry. Yes. It's our census, but also there is something about our local surveys. We have local surveys for instance, to measure things about migration, specifically migration, and those are for the the north border. Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. And a question for Ellen. Ellen, has there ever been an attempt to incorporate air quality measures into the tree analysis?
Yeah, thanks, Mara. So air quality is in the census, or it's not in the census. It is in the data that we use. So there's a number of variables from the EPA that are included, and then another interesting data set, which is kind of adjacent to air quality, is from the CDC. It's called Places, and it looks at like things like asthma rates and other health impacts that can be caused by air pollution or other types of pollution. So yes, and those things are fully customizable, which we heard was really important for folks that were writing grants. Like for instance, thinking about youth and air pollution, for instance, like where are asthma rates high for youth and things like that. So.
All right, thank you. Again, let's keep those questions coming in the Q&A session. Francisco, I have a question for you. And I'm going to apologize in advance because I am not an economics person. So if this comes off as completely ridiculous, I apologize. I saw in your slides you initially highlighted both the Thiel and the Gini indexes, but you looked like you settled on the Thiel. I was curious what was the one advantage of one over the other.
All right, thank you, Mara. Well, your question is pretty much fair. Traditionally, everybody knows the Gini index as the gold coin for income inequality. However, while the measures are pretty much similar, I have it in an appendix. You can have the scatter plot and the comparison. They are pretty much similar. The difference with the Gini index is that it doesn't have some mathematical properties such that it can be totally or fully decomposed. So there are some new methods in which the Gini index is intended to be decomposed, but the difference mostly relies on how this decomposition of the Gini index can bring with itself all of the mathematical properties in terms of reflecting inequality accurately at disaggregated levels. So I'm going to say it into these simple and plain words. Of course, there are some other very granular details that I would love to share with you or with any participant in the future. But the point is that it's because of the properties of the Thiel index are more appropriate to be decomposed in comparison to the Gini index. However, in the overall spectrum, they look similar. So that's one of the reasons I just continue following the Thiel index.
All right, thank you. I don't see any more questions, so I think we're going to wrap things up. Anyway, I want to thank all of the speakers for their insights today, and I hope that everybody enjoys the rest of the conference.